Great to see you today. It is good to be together. If we have not yet met, my name is Dave, and I am one of the pastors here. Before we get to the message, though, I do want to just say what a gift it really is to be a part of a church that leans in on ministry the way this church does. Not just Royal Family, but a lot of ministries. But 25 years serving foster kids who really need love, who have, in a lot of ways, gotten like a raw deal in life. And to love those kids with the love of Christ is a gift. Over 1,000 campers, that's amazing. All the lives that have been touched. It really is, our mission here is becoming like Jesus and making him known. It's not just a slogan for us. If you're new around here, we actually want to become like Jesus and live like him in the world. Camp is one of the ways that I think that happens really, really well. So, one more time, do it. Pray, serve. Jump in on camp, give money. Like that's good dollars invested in great kingdom work. Be a part of that. It's worth it. It makes Jesus smile. I know that to be true. And speaking of Jesus, we're going to talk about him a little more today as we continue our series through his life. If you have a Bible this morning, pull it out, turn to Matthew chapter 17. We're going to look at a story in this chapter. Today is actually a pivotal moment. In fact, in all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this story is the climactic and resounding answer to the question that has been boiling and building up throughout the gospels. Who in the world is this Jesus? Who is this that the wind and waves obey him? Who is this that has the power to forgive sins? Who is this that can drive out demons and heal lepers' skin and multiply food by the thousands? Who in the world is this Jesus? But not just that, we'll also talk today about the what and how and why of Jesus. Let me be more clear. Today's story will answer 4 central questions for us. Who is Jesus? What did he come to do? How does it happen? And why do we need this? It's a really good story, so let's read it together. Matthew chapter 17, starting in verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright light covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. I want to start today with a few cultural references, and here's how this will work. I am going to make a statement, and then you get to participate. You get to guess who that statement refers to. And you can feel free to just call it out or just answer in the privacy of your own heart, whatever you're comfortable with. Shouldn't be too hard. I hope you go 4 for 4. The first service, but you guys are smarter, I know. Here, you ready? Here's the first one. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really bad. My wife just laughed at my face. You probably missed it back there, but she just laughed like that was the worst Elvis impression she's ever heard. But that was, in fact, Elvis, the king of rock and roll. Okay, number 2. I'll do better on this one. That's one small step for man. Can I finish the statement? One giant leap for mankind. Neil Armstrong, the first human being on the moon. Number 3, ready? Ain't I a woman? Oh, come on, Cedar Mill. I'm so disappointed in you. Sojourner Truth. Yeah, read about her. She's just a super amazing, solid believer of a woman who's an abolitionist and a women's rights advocate in the 1800s. Amazing. She said, "Ain't I a woman?" It's really good. Okay, last one's a little more fun. Ready? Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. The hands can't hit what the eyes can't see. There were so many good Muhammad Ali quotes. It took me like an hour to decide on that one, and I'm still sort of have a couple more floating around. But yeah, Muhammad Ali. Why? Why are we doing this today? Why do we start the message in this way? It's because Matthew begins our story today with some cultural references of his own. He starts off with some details that would have triggered in the minds of his first century Jewish readers, and they would have had someone that came to mind for them. So let's take a look at him. He mentions right off the bat 6 days. Notice how he mentions that. He's specific about it. 6 days, he says. After 6 days, he talks about going up a mountain. He talks about a face that shone like the sun, and he talks about a cloud. Now, if you were a first century Jewish reader, you would certainly and you would instantly pick up on the reference here. Because what or who does this remind them of? This reminds them of Moses. Moses, the one who in Exodus 24 also went up on a mountain and after 6 days of waiting encountered God in a cloud. Moses, whose face also glowed with the radiance of the Lord's glory when he came down. Friends, we must never forget that the gospel of Jesus' story is rooted in the Exodus story. It's planted in a story of deliverance and redemption and freedom. And time again, Jesus is said to be the new Moses, the final Moses, the one who comes to bring ultimate deliverance and redemption and freedom. See, right away, we understand that this story is telling us not just that Jesus is Messiah, but the kind of Messiah Jesus is. Last week, you'll remember, if you were here, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And then they answer, and then he asked them pointedly, "But you, how about you? Who do you say that I am?" And then Peter, my favorite disciple, speaks up because he's always speaking for the group. And he says, "You, Jesus, are Messiah, the Son of the living God." And that's correct, that's right. But what does it mean? What does it mean that Jesus is Messiah? You see, even though Matthew draws some parallels between Jesus and Moses, there are some big differences between Jesus and Moses. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and his face starts to glow. It starts to radiate like the moon. In other words, God's radiance was absorbed by Moses and then reflected from Moses. But Jesus, on the other hand, he radiates God's glory like the sun. God's glory is not just reflected off of him, it comes from within him. Here's another thing. You notice that Matthew says his clothes became as white as the light. Matthew is really focused in here on Jesus' outfit. In Mark, he goes a little farther. He says his clothes were dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. A lot of time and attention here. And the gospel writers are pointing this out because, again, first century Jewish readers would catch the reference. The reference to Daniel chapter 7, and the story about the Ancient of Days, or God himself, whose clothing was white as snow. You see, it turns out Jesus' clothing looks a lot like God's clothing. But here's the question. Are the disciples catching this? Are they picking up what's being put down? Are they understanding the message? Look at how Peter responds. He says, If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. What's Peter saying? He's saying, this is a big moment. We got like the Hall of Fame here, the trifecta of Jewish faith in the house, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Let's put up 3 shelters. That word shelters is actually the word for tabernacles. 3 places of worship. Let's worship God, he's saying. Peter's trying to be real spiritual, but it actually just reveals that he still does not get it. So what happens? While he was speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased." God cuts Peter off. You ever been cut off by God? Peter has. God just interrupts him here, just like jumps right in on him and says ultimately the exact same thing that he's already said at Jesus' baptism. This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased. God is reaffirming Jesus' identity to them again. He's saying, you may have missed it the first time, but let me be clear once more. Jesus is not just another religious preacher or leader. He's not just a rabbi or a revolutionary. He's not even a prophet who comes to speak for God. He is the very presence of God. You see, it's no accident, friends, that the final statement of this whole scene, remember I've told you how stories start and how they end are really important? Listen to how this story ends. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. No one except Jesus. This story teaches us that Jesus stands alone, that he is above all, that there is no one else like him. Who is this Jesus? He, as the writer of Hebrews says, is the Son. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. He is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. Jesus is the incarnation of the Father. But not just that. What did he come to do? We notice that right in the middle of this story, the disciples get what? They get scared. In fact, they're so scared that they fell face down to the ground, terrified. Why? Why so scared? Why are they terrified? I'll tell you why. It's because of this cloud. They are terrified of this cloud. Anyone else in here afraid of clouds? It's called cloudophobia. No, I just made that up. I'm just kidding. That's not true. But they're scared of this cloud. Why? Every place in the Old Testament when the glory cloud of God shows up, contact with that cloud is lethal. In fact, on Mount Sinai, the people are told, don't even have your cattle go on the mountain at all when the cloud is on it, or else your cattle will die. And even Moses himself, when he asked to see God's face, when he asked God to look at him in the cloud, what does God say to him? He says, no, not a good idea, Moses. He says, if you see my face, Moses, you will certainly die. So God takes him and he puts him in this little crevice, this little like cleft in the rock, and he just passes by so that Moses gets a glimpse of him, just a glimpse of his back, like just a little look at like the vapor trail of his glory, because that's all that Moses can handle. So again, in our story today, this cloud shows up and the disciples are like, this is it. It's curtains for us. Game over. Lights out. We are toast. But they aren't. They don't die. They live. Why? Because Jesus has come to make the glory of God available to us. We can now be in it. We can be connected to it. The power and presence of God are no longer far off, but near in Jesus. Friends, let me ask you this morning. Do you know that the glory and the presence and the power of God is available to you in Jesus? Do you know that that's why we're here, to remember that the glory and power and presence of God is available to us? Someone knows. By the way, the word glory, I love that word. It's like one of my favorite Bible words because it's not just like, we think of glory as like fame and adoration, but glory in the scriptures is about gravity. It's about weight and weightiness and significance. That's why the most glorious being of all is God. He's the most significant. He has the most weight to himself. In other words, friends, this passage is saying that you can walk through this world with the weight and the significance and the gravity of God in your life and on your side. Do you need the gravity of God in your life today? How does this happen? How do we get this gravity? How do we experience this thing that God is offering us in this story? Well, one thing we must see is that in this story there are actually two commands. And the first one is considered by most scholars to be the climax of this moment. It's this moment when the voice of God the Father comes from the cloud. And what does he say? What's the command he gives to the disciples? Listen to him. Listen to Jesus. Do you want to know how to walk in glory? Do you want to experience God's power and presence in your life here and now? Do you want to be connected to the confidence and significance of the Lord? Then listen to Jesus. Well, what does that mean? Friends, this word listen is not thin. It's not a thin word, it's a thick word. It's a word that goes far beyond just hearing sounds. In fact, in the Old Testament, there is a section from Deuteronomy chapter 6 called the Shema. And it was considered to be one of, if not the most important section of the Bible. In fact, the Israelites, they would recite these words constantly. They would recite them daily, morning and night, over and over again. Here's what they'd say. This is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Over and over and again, those words would just roll off the tongues of first century God followers. Let's say it together, will you? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. That first word here is the word Shema. And it's also the Greek word from our story today, listen. The Greek word for Shema is the word that God uses, listen. You see, friends, to listen to Jesus is to love Jesus with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. It's to give him your time and focus and attention and obedience. It's to make him not just a priority in your life, but the priority of your life. Some have said that this might just be the most basic posture of a disciple, of a follower, of an apprentice of Jesus Christ, to listen to Jesus. Here's another thing. This whole event happens on a mountain, and mountains in the Bible were holy places. They were set apart places. They were places where you would go up to be close to God and to connect with God and to do business with God. And we've seen throughout this series how the gospel writers love details. You notice this, right? They love to share details, especially Matthew. He's always giving us the specifics, the specific names and places and locations of things. He's always dropping references, right? But here, the mountain that Jesus climbs with his disciples is not named. By the way, most scholars believe it was probably Mount Hermon, the highest mountain in that region, just shy of 10,000 feet. So they went for a hike. And if you remember last week, they were in Caesarea Philippi. This mountain is right close to there. But again, we don't really know because the mountain is not named. Why? It's intentional. It's a way of inviting us, you and me, the readers, to find our own mountain, our own place of experience and connection and listening to Jesus. Last weekend, our youth went off to winter camp, and this is what the whole weekend was about. The theme of the whole weekend, the theme of the whole camp was the sacred pause. And it was a really cool logo, and they got really awesome sweatshirts, and I didn't get one because Luke doesn't care about me at all. But the message to the students was, take time for Jesus. Spend time with Jesus. Listen and learn to listen to Jesus. Why? So that the weight and glory and magnitude and majesty of God can buoy you up through the storms of your life. Do you have a mountain, friends? Do you have a place and a pattern of meeting with Jesus to experience him and connect with him and listen to him? Friday night this week, as in 2 days ago, we had a worship and prayer night right here in this room. And the whole point of that night was to go up the mountain together, to get into the presence of Jesus together. Like 20 of you were here. A lot more of you needed to be here, but our feeling was we need to spend more time up the mountain if we're going to do any good down the mountain. And before I move on, I'll just say one more thing about this, because notice they don't go up on the mountain of Transfiguration alone. Jesus doesn't just take Peter or just take James or just take John. They go up as a group, as a community. And Jesus never says, okay, guys, now grab your Bibles and your journals and move off by yourself to a quiet place alone. He never says this. And yes, side note, it is very, very important for you to have time alone to listen to Jesus. Make that a habit. Make that a priority in your life. But together time with Jesus is and always has been central to a life following the Lord. Pastor Dave Lomas says it this way: there is something a tree, a surfer, and disciples have in common: the need for position. You see, a tree will grow tall and strong if it's planted in the right spot, in a position with good light and water and soil. And a surfer will catch a wave if they know where to wait and when to paddle, if they put themselves in the right position. And we as disciples, as followers of Jesus, we can't force a word from God. We can't force an experience of God, but we can position ourselves. We can show up and listen. You see, sometimes, I'll be real, church is just church. Just church. I mean, we come, people say, how was church? How was church? It was fine. It was good. It was good. Church was good. We sang, we shared communion, we had a sermon. No one's face melted off or anything, but you were here. You showed up. And that's what you do. You show up because at some point when you are in position, the glory cloud of God is going to envelop you, and you are going to be empowered and encouraged and challenged and convicted or healed or changed or transformed. You got to get in position. Friends, do you know that the word for transfigured in this story, when it says it in verse 2, Jesus was transfigured before them? That sounds like really intense, doesn't it? Like Jesus is like a transformer, more than meets the eyes. Autobots rage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. Some of you are like, I don't know what's happening right now, but if you were a child of the 80s, you know, right? Like Jesus was transfigured before them. Friends, this is just the word that's used throughout the New Testament to describe what happens to followers of Jesus as they walk with him and listen to him. Same word. Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. Be transfigured, just like Jesus, by the renewing of your mind. 2 Corinthians 3, and we all of us who follow Christ, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transfigured into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Friends, this is not just a story about the transfiguration of Jesus, but how Jesus wants to transform you. Why? Why does he want to transform you? Why is this so important? Why do we so desperately need this transformation? This is my favorite part of the message. So if I've lost you, let me reconnect with you right now. The second command of this story comes when the disciples are down on their faces, terrified. And what does Jesus say to them? Get up, don't be afraid. Do you know that one of the enemy's biggest weapons in our lives is fear? Do you know that if he can get you afraid, if he can keep you nervous, if he can make you anxious, he can keep you quiet. He can hold you back. He can prevent you from walking in the power and promises and plans that God has for your life. You see, fear says, stay down, but Jesus says, get on up. Listen to me. My perfect love will cast out fear. Friends, this is why prioritizing time with Jesus is so important, because it drives out fear. Got any fear? Got any anxiety? Got any worry in your life these days? Worried about our world? Worried about this nation? Worried about government stuff? Worried about our city? Worried about your family? Worried about your kids? Stressed about some upcoming round of layoffs? Scared about what the report from the doctor might say? Anxious about your future? Concerned that you'll never fulfill your dreams? Listen to Jesus. Listen to what he has to say about those fears. Lord, will I succeed or will I fail? Do I have enough money? Am I a good person? Am I a good Christian? Do people like me? Friends, the fears and anxieties and stresses of this life are constant and never ending. They will just keep coming. But when you remember that the God of the universe loves you, that he's with you, that he's for you, that he has a plan for you, that he's 100% fully in control, fear about the things of this life subsides. It goes away, and we are given in its place courage and peace that surpasses all understanding. You want peace that surpasses all understanding? Listen to Jesus. This is what happened at camp this weekend. Youths from our church, middle schoolers and high schoolers, went in with fears and concerns and worries and anxieties, and they came out a little more bold, a little less weighed down, a little more strengthened by the glory of God in their lives. This is what happened on Friday night at the worship night. This is what happens, or it's supposed to happen, when we gather on Sunday mornings, or when you go to your mountain, your quiet place to meet with God. Fear gets driven out, and the courage of Christ is put in its place. One of the best examples of this reality, of how this actually works, is Martin Luther King Jr. Some of you will remember the last sermon he gave. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, he said. Do you remember that message? I mean, if you hear it or read it, it's packed with courage and confidence and boldness and fearlessness. He says, and I quote, I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. But that's not the full story. Because before that, if you've studied Dr. King, you know that he had a crisis of faith. In fact, in a sermon called Our God is Able, he talked about the opposition and the hatred he was facing. He talked about the threats against himself and his family. He talked in that message very vulnerably, and he confessed that he had fear, and that fear had begun to win in him, that his confidence in God was waning, and that he, in fact, did not want to continue in his calling. He talked about one night in particular where he received a threatening phone call that shook him to the core. Listen to his words. He says, "I hung up, but I couldn't sleep. It seemed that all of my fears had come down on me at once. I had reached the saturation point. I got out of bed and began to walk the floor. Finally, I went to the kitchen and heated a pot of coffee. I was ready to give up. With my coffee cup sitting untouched before me, I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing a coward. In this state of exhaustion, when my courage had all but gone, I decided to take my problem to God. With my head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and prayed aloud the words. I spoke them to God that midnight, and they're still vivid in my memory. I am here, taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I am afraid. The people are looking to me, Lord, for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I'm at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I have come to the point where I can't face it alone." At that moment, King says, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced him before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, "Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever." Almost at once, my fears began to go. My uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face anything. The outer situation remained the same, but God had given me the inner calm to face it. 3 nights later, on January 30th, as you know, our home was bombed. Strangely enough, I accepted the work of the bombing calmly. My experience with God a few nights before had given me the strength to face it. Friends, why do we need to listen to Jesus? Why do we need to go up on to the mountain and meet with God together? Because we need that kind of courage. We need the same kind of courage in our day that Dr. King had in his day. We need the same kind of courage that Peter and James and John eventually found. We need the kind of courage that can only be discovered when we get up on a mountain and experience and connect and listen to Jesus. We need the kind of courage that comes from singing together and declaring together and remembering together that Jesus' name is the highest name, that his name is the greatest name, that he stands above them all, above every other power or dominion or position in this entire world and reality. He is above it all, and he stands with us. So let's stand together right now and sing out our fears. Got any fears you need to sing into? Stand with me and let's sing together. Let's declare that Christ is Lord. Amen.